Hello you all and welcome back to Living Unveiled with Maddie. In the previous message, we held up a mirror. We looked honestly at what is happening all around us. We talked about the growing instability of marriage, the increasingly casual reasons many people now give for entering into marriage, and how something that was once treated with reverence has slowly begun to be treated as ordinary. But if we're going to go deeper, we must now ask a more important question. If marriage is covenant, what exactly is covenant? Because covenant is not simply a word that is attached to weddings. Covenant is one of the most important ideas in the entire Bible. In fact, covenant is the language through which God relates to humanity. When God reveals himself in scripture, he reveals himself again and again as the one who makes and keeps covenants. Psalm 89 verse 34 says, "My covenant I will not violate, nor alter the word that went forth from my lips." That verse tells us something important. God does not treat covenant casually. When God makes covenant, he binds himself to it with faithfulness. And if covenant is the language through which God relates to his people, it should not surprise us that the closest human relationship God designed, marriage, is also described in scripture as covenant. Malachi speaks about marriage in very direct terms in Malachi 2:14. He said, "The Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth. She is your companion and your wife by covenant." Notice that phrase carefully, your wife by covenant. Marriage is not merely companionship. Marriage is covenant. And God himself stands as witness to that covenant. But one of the quiet problems of our generation is that we have been trained to think in contracts, not covenants. Contracts operate on conditions. A contract says, "I will keep my part as long as you keep yours." But covenant operates differently. Covenant says, "I remain faithful to the promise I made before God, not only when circumstances are easy, but because I have pledged my life to it." That kind of faithfulness is what scripture calls steadfast love. Hosea 6 verse 6 says, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offering." The word used there carries the meaning of covenant loyalty. Faithfulness that remains even when emotions fluctuate. And this is where marriage begins to expose the human heart. Because covenant is easy to celebrate on the wedding day. But covenant is learned in the ordinary rhythms of life. Marriage has a way of revealing things about us that we did not know were there. Pride, selfishness, impatience, expectations we never examined. And sometimes the things that frustrate us most in marriage are not dramatic betrayers. They are the small things like the shirt thrown on a neatly made bed, the toothpaste squeezed from the middle instead of the bottom, the toilet seats left down again after you mentioned it yesterday. Small irritations, daily annoyance, and before long, two people who once stood before God making solemn vows can quietly begin wondering, why did I marry this person? But scripture invites us to see something deeper. Because beyond the man who sometimes irritates you is the man God placed in your position of headship, reflecting Christ's relationship to his church. Ephesians tells us that the relationship between husband and wife reflects something eternal. The husband represents Christ, the wife represents the church, and marriage becomes a living illustration of the gospel. And here's where many people misunderstand scripture. Now, biblical headship is not domination, neither is it ego or control. Biblical headship is sacrifice. Christ proved his authority not by dominating his bride, but by laying down his life for her. Unfortunately, many men in our time have never been taught what covenant leadership actually looks like. Instead of understanding their role as sacrificial responsibility, many have been shaped by a culture that tells them that masculinity is proven through ego, pleasure, and conquest. But biblical headship carries weight, responsibility, and spiritual covering. When the man abandons that calling, marriage begins to lose its structure. Yet something else has also happened in our time, because entire conversations about marriage have grown around the surface of the relationship without touching the depths. Books have been written, seminars organized, platforms built. In some cases, entire empires have formed around marriage counseling. And while many of these conversations contain helpful advice about communication, emotional intelligence, and conflict resolution, something essential is often missing. The conversation really goes deep enough to talk about covenants. Instead, many teachings circle around one central topic again and again: sex, attraction, chemistry. In some spaces, it almost sounds as though sexual satisfaction is the primary ingredient that sustains a marriage. But scripture never presents marriage that way. Now listen, sex is not the foundation of marriage. It is the expression of covenants. Genesis tells us that a man and woman become one flesh. But that physical union was never meant to replace the spiritual covenant that binds their life together. When sex becomes the center of the conversation, something important is reversed, because sex was designed to flow from covenants and not replace it. This is why marriage built primarily on attraction often will struggle when life becomes difficult. Attraction can ignite a relationship, but attraction alone cannot sustain covenants. Covenants require something deeper. It requires faithfulness, endurance, commitment before God. And that endurance is often formed through the very pressures of life. Romans 5 verse 3 to 4 explains this process by saying that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character in turn produces hope. Marriage becomes one of the environments where endurance is learned. Not because marriage was designed to create suffering, but because covenant requires perseverance. It requires learning to love beyond mood, convenience, and temporal emotion. And this is why scripture ultimately points marriage beyond itself. Paul writes something remarkable in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 2. He said, "For I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure bride to Christ." Think about that language: betrothed, engaged, and prepared. The church is being prepared for a future marriage, which means earthly marriage was never meant to be the final destination. Marriage is preparation, because Jesus himself said something many people overlook in Matthew 22 verse 30. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. Again, earthly marriage is temporal, but there's one marriage that will never end. Preparation is required. Faithfulness is required. Understanding covenants is a very essential commodity, and marriage becomes one of the places where that preparation begins, because through marriage, God begins to shape the human heart to understand covenant loyalty, to understand endurance, faithfulness, and love that remains even when circumstances are not easy. Titus 2:14 tells us that Christ gave himself for us to purify for himself a people that are his very own. God is preparing a people, and marriage becomes one of the classrooms where we begin to learn that language, because covenant cannot be understood only through teaching. It must be practiced. It must be practiced in patience, practiced in forgiveness, and practiced in faithfulness when emotions fluctuate. When we begin to see marriage in this way, something changes. Marriage stops being merely a romantic relationship between two individuals. It becomes preparation. Preparation for the day when the bride finally meets her bridegroom. Now, if this message has helped you reflect on marriage in a deeper way, take a moment to share it with someone who may need to hear it. You can also engage in the comments and share your reflections, because these conversations help us all grow in understanding. And if you would like to follow this series as it unfolds, be sure to follow the channel and turn on your notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Because in the next episode, we will begin exploring something many believers rarely talk about. Why does the enemy attack marriage so aggressively? And once we understand that, we'll begin to see why covenant is one of the most important things believers must recover in our time. So until next time, stay unveiled.